Although films about World War II are plentiful and abundant, few use satire and dark humor to portray the event as well as Inglourious Basterds and Devils on the Doorstep. Each deals with the war in a different theater, and each possesses characteristics distinct to either American or Chinese films. Through analysis of Devils on the Doorstep and Inglourious Basterds, it is evidence that despite differences in film techniques, storytelling, and humor, the filmmakers converge their goal to satirically rewrite history. Inglourious Basterds, a 2009 satirical war film directed by Quentin Tarantino, follows multiple storylines on the European battle theater. The film begins with German soldiers searching for a Jewish family, killing all but one young woman. This young woman ends up plotting with an infatuated German to kill Nazis at a film screening. Meanwhile, a special service force named the Basterds recruits both Jewish fighters as well as one German. After an undercover member of the Basterds is discovered at the tavern and violence ensues, the scene of the film premiere begins. At the premiere's climax, the Allies shoot up the theater in a comedic fashion, while Nazi leader Landa has a swastika ironically carved into his forehead. Devils on the Doorstep, a 2000 black comedy directed by Jiang, centers around Chinese peasants at the end of the Sino-Japanese War. The film begins with protagonist Ma Da-san receiving two prisoners from a mysterious figure. They decide to acquiesce and keep both the Japanese soldier and Chinese interpreter captive indefinitely. Eventually, the villagers lose patience and plan to kill the prisoners. However, they remain alive due to Da-san's and an assassin's incompetence. Hanaya, the Japanese captive, causes controversy, and this eventually leads to a Japanese general ransacking the village and murdering villagers. After the war is over, Da-san decides to take revenge by killing two Japanese POWs. This backfires, and a Chinese general eventually orders a Japanese soldier to ironically execute Da-san.
Devils on the Doorstep and Inglourious Basterds tell their stories using humor and satire to highlight both the tragedy and absurdity of the events of World War II. In Devils on the Doorstep, the director uses comedy and over-exaggeration to portray the stereotypes of the different parties in the Pacific theater of World War II. For example, the Japanese soldier that was captured, Hanaya, was extremely chauvinistic for his country and always looked down on his Chinese captors, even though they had all the power over him. The medium close-up shot used in the scene does a very good job of showing these emotions of hatred on Hanaya's face. Furthermore, the Japanese hostages attempted to trick a young boy into repeating a Japanese phrase in front of the imperial soldiers that the Chinese boy thought would give him more candy from the soldiers, but it was actually a phrase telling them that they were held prisoners in the Great Wall. These two scenes show the two parties during World War II, the Chinese villagers and the Japanese soldiers, with a hyperbolic representation of how they carry themselves. This exaggeration is used to highlight their stereotypes, the overzealous and arrogance of Japanese soldiers and the foolishness of Chinese peasants. According to Filming the Anti-Japanese War by Julia Ward, the Chinese government didn't portray it as that. The article states that the Chinese Film Bureau thought that the way the Chinese villagers were characterized in the movie was insufficiently patriotic and barred Jiang Wen from making movies in China for 7 years. If the Chinese government paid attention to why the villagers were portrayed as foolish in the context of the whole film, then they would have understood that this film wasn't made to spite the Chinese, but rather to exaggerate these characteristics to make it easier for the audience to catch the stereotypes of the different parties in Pacific World War II.
The comedy in Inglourious Basterds comes from the jarring jump cuts and quick cuts that will interrupt conversations to show acts of grotesque violence, and the quick zoom-ins of the camera when the action starts. The performances of the actors also adds to the comedic nature of the film. The enthusiasm of the Bastards during these acts of violence is shown in close-up shots of their face as they brutally murder the Nazis. Inglourious Basterds creates a lot of humor in the subversion of audience expectations as well. When the Bastards infiltrate the theater, the mise-en-scene is very similar to that of a James Bond film. The bright lighting, beautiful sets, and the expensive suits and dresses worn by the characters set the scene of the Bastards infiltrating the high society environment where their enemy awaits for them. However, while a typical film would have the heroes blend in and deceive the enemy, Aldo Rain's thick southern twang immediately gives them away.
Buongiorno.
Inglourious Basterds tells a World War II revenge story but does so in a comedic manner, allowing the audience to laugh not only at the actions of the characters, but also at the absurdity of the war itself. However, while both films are dark comedies, the conclusions of each couldn't be more different. Devils on the Doorstep sees Da-san executed after trying and failing to avenge the massacre of his fellow villagers, while Inglourious Basterds sees the villainous Nazi Colonel Hans Landa get his comeuppance for his crimes.
Often the perspective a film takes can tell us a lot about the message being made. Devils on the Doorstep follows the peasants of a village under the control of the Imperial Japanese, who are suddenly thrust into conflict by the coercion of Chinese resistance forces. Inglourious Basterds follows a group of Jewish volunteers as they fight through the countryside of France, terrorizing German soldiers and inevitably seeking to murder the German high command. The use of both of these perspectives is used to flip the script, so to speak, on the accepted history of the war. In the case of Devils on the Doorstep, Jiang Wen looks to turn the narrative of patriotic and unwavering Chinese citizen, and instead look at the unfortunate consequences of citizens caught in the crossfire of a war they never wanted. Rather than have the peasants of the village readily accept the task of holding the hostages, it shows the difficult position they are put in because of this, and how it leads to their eventual slaughter at the hands of the Japanese. In Inglourious Basterds, Tarantino wanted to change the story of Jewish people being the victims of World War II. He said, "We've seen that story before. I want to see something different. Let's see Germans that are scared of Jews." And so he sought out to create a story where, rather than the Jewish constantly being the victims on the run, they become the executioners of countless Nazi soldiers and even Hitler himself in the end. In addition to taking a specific perspective for narrative purposes, both films also took their perspective to appeal towards a specific audience. Devils on the Doorstep was inspired by Jiang experience of the films the Chinese made about their war with Japan. He is quoted as saying, "Once you've peeled away all the packaging, there's nothing left inside," in reference to how the movies were trumped up and inaccurate portrayals of the war. Because of this, as noted by Julian Ward in his essay, Filming the Anti-Japanese War, he opted to use the black and white cinematography to cause his audience to relate his film alongside those made by the Chinese during the war, however having his film take a more realistic stance. This stance ended up getting him banned from making films in China. Inglourious Basterds is meant for a very different audience. William Martell summed up in his review of the film script that the movie is meant to be the end-all be-all for World War II action films. In this way, much like Devils on the Doorstep satirizes the nationalistic Chinese cinema, Tarantino is exaggerating the average American World War II film.
Despite the differences between Jiang Wen's and Tarantino's style, each film successfully repaints the picture of their respective war theaters. Each realizes that while history cannot be changed, the power of film can be used to satirically comment on the serious issues that World War II brought about. The most important lesson we draw from this analysis remains, even in the most comedic of settings, this war turned society on its head and affected it for generations.